Hello. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm delighted to see you all here today. My name is Sarah Kelly Oler, and I'm the Field McCormick Chair and Curator of Arts of the Americas, and I am also the Vice President of Curatorial Strategy. And it's just my pleasure to be able to introduce this program with my wonderful colleagues here today. We're going to take a behind-the-scenes look at the newly reinstalled galleries for European design in the Eloise W. Martin galleries, which are 231 to 235 on the second floor. Now, this fresh display presents more than 300 objects, about 40% more than were previously installed, including rarely seen works, new acquisitions, and notable loans from private collections. Today, you'll hear from the three curators from Applied Arts of Europe who worked in close collaboration with our architectural partners, Barozzi Vega, to realize this stunning installation. And they are Ellenor Alcorn, who is the Chair and Eloise W. Martin Curator, Jonathan Tavares, the Amy and Paul Carbone Curator, and Christopher, or Kit, Maxwell, who's the Samuel and M. Patricia Grober Curator. But before we begin, I want to take a moment to personally congratulate Ellenor, not just on this reinstallation, which is momentous, truly momentous, but also to celebrate her upcoming retirement. I think this is maybe your last program. Ellenor joined the Art Institute in 2018, arriving from the Metropolitan Museum of Art with more than 28 years, sorry, Ellenor, of broad decorative arts experience. And during her 7 years here at the Art Institute, Ellenor has led her department through the reconfiguration and expansion of the renowned Arts and Armors collection, brought in new colleagues to broaden the department's areas of expertise, and steward the collection through strategic acquisitions that prioritized exceptional quality and elevated new narratives of global exchange. And of course, most recently, Ellenor has been the driving force behind the sweeping reinstallation that you'll hear about today. And it's really a testament to Ellenor's exceptional vision, vigorous scholarship, and profound care of the collection, as well as collaboration with all of our colleagues. So Ellenor, on behalf of all of us at the Art Institute, thank you for all that you've done in contributing to the museum over these past years. So thank you again. All right. And so now it is my profound pleasure to welcome Ellenor, Kit, and Jonathan to the stage to share more about their new galleries and this vibrant period of European design. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction and for, of course, all the accolades we can give to Ellenor. So I have the distinguished joy to be sort of the MC today, the moderator, if you will. And so today we'll start off with an introduction from Ellenor as our fearless leader over these perhaps 5 years that we've been planning this renovation. So Ellenor will give a version of a view to her vision that she had for this installation, followed by Kit. And Kit really has been the curatorial backbone for the content for these galleries, truly. So many labels, Kit. Anyway, and Kit will give further depth as to what is new and exciting about these galleries and their design. And then we'll have what I hope will be a lively conversation about some of the great themes and objects that are in the installation. So take it away, Ellenor.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Sarah, for such a warm recognition. Many of you, I hope, have had a moment to visit the new galleries just upstairs. You'll remember, I think, from the previous installation, which you can see on the left-hand side of your screen. The galleries, as they stand now, occupy exactly the same footprint, but it's been completely reconfigured. One of the things we wanted to do was to give the visitor a real storyline to bite into, which I think was lacking in the previous installation, which dated back to 2009. But I think you'll also see very quickly that there is a very different sensibility and aesthetic with the very clear glass cases that you see in the new installation on the right-hand side of your screen. As Sarah mentioned, we were working with a wonderful architectural team, Barazzi Vega, and they brought wonderful standards to their suggestions. But of course, we had a whole network of colleagues across the museum who contributed in countless ways, particularly in the areas of conservation and capital projects. So curatorial team, research backup from our own department, and help from across the museum. But Kit, I think, has a few words to say about how we arrived at the design sensibility and the layout as it stands now.
So the galleries, the new galleries complete the enfilade that begins in the Deering family galleries with Arms and Armour and the Medieval and Renaissance collection. And it crosses this rather restrained and elegant stairwell, the Morton stairwell from the 1960s, culminating in our new space. And you can see on the far right, the galleries cleared out of the former installation. Essentially, they were an empty box. There was no historic architectural molding or detailing to accommodate. It was a blank canvas. So the challenge was really to develop a new design vocabulary that was suitable for 300 years of European design and a multitude of media, ceramics, glass, metalwork, furniture, and also one that retained this open vista through the length of the gallery, which we all agreed was much more inviting. We wanted the new galleries to feel fresh and forward-looking, not nostalgic and historicizing. And we wanted them really to embrace the spirit of innovation that we feel is present in so many of the works of art on display. So we decided to focus on the refinement and sophistication of the materials that we used. We didn't want to be totally anachronistic and ahistorical, so we took inspiration from historic interiors, particularly those that used natural materials such as stone. And what we came up with was this rather elegant, subdued palette, but also a really beautiful Belgian limestone that lines the surfaces of the furniture platforms and many of the case interiors, combined with a sleek and contemporary terrazzo flooring, which I think is a very happy combination. Another element of the galleries that I hope you'll enjoy is the storytelling, the interpretation. The previous installation had very little of this, but in the new galleries, visitors can learn about individual objects or about particular groupings. And this is a permanent collection gallery. It's not a temporary exhibition. So there isn't one single thesis or narrative. And we present many ways in which to approach and understand and enjoy the objects. But one theme that did emerge, or does emerge consistently, quite naturally throughout our collection, is Europe's expansion during this period. It's intellectual expansion, but also territorial expansion. And this video you see on the screen is a snippet from one that plays in the galleries that shows the growth of Europe's 5 largest empires during this period, 1600 to 1900, and the ocean trade routes that developed alongside that. And of course, all this had a profound impact on the development of design. Also, we wanted to acknowledge the complexity of Europe's internal geopolitics during this period. And on the screen, you see a map of Italy in 1789. And you'll notice that it's not the unified nation that we would recognize today as Italy, but rather a patchwork of kingdoms, of principalities, and of duchies. And we felt that it was really important to acknowledge these borders when considering the movement of people, of materials and ideas, and the really, really profound impact this had on the development and evolution of European design. And this you can see reflected in our labels in the galleries.
Thanks so much, Kit. So I recall way back in our conceptual phase, we were having brainstorming sessions. Particularly, I remember, Ellenor, we were doing this. We were trying to think about objects in the collection and major themes that revolved around them, and how to best pull that out for what is unique to our collection and what stories we can tell. And these really became the driving force for how the installation was organized and the narratives that are going through. So we're going to explore some of those here now. Of course, we can't do all of them, but we'll do a small selection that I think is our favorites. And chronologically speaking, as you walk down this gallery, if you start in the 17th century, this is one of the first great themes and cases that you meet right off from the bat from the 17th century. Now, I was familiar with the concept, but not so much the term mercantilism. So, Kit, what is mercantilism, please?
It was probably my accent that confused you, but I'm happy to explain. Mercantilism was an economic philosophy that was prominent in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was nationalistic, it was protectionist, it was tariff-heavy, nothing new in history. But it held that, it was a sort of a mercantile capitalism. It held that you bought low in one market to sell high in another. And it resulted in the chartering of Europe's various joint stock trading companies, including the East India companies. And these companies really competed quite ferociously to secure the most lucrative trade agreements, in the case of the East India companies, with East Asia. And they brought back with them into Europe luxury commodities such as porcelain, cotton, silk, spices, tea, which they then re-exported to more local markets. And mercantilism also had the sort of the secondary influence of stimulating local manufacturers to compete with the influx of imported commodities. So it was really it was very closely tied to the development of design in this period. And this vase is a fantastic example of this sort of dual impact. It was made in Delft in the Netherlands in about 1680. And at that time, the Dutch East India Company was the most powerful corporation, trading corporation operating in Asia. And one of its most popular commodities was Chinese porcelain, which it brought back to Europe. However, in the mid-1600s, China closed its doors to foreign trade during a period of political transition. But the market for Chinese porcelain in Europe remained. And this gave the Dutch potteries an opportunity to refine their own local ceramic formulas and to produce wares that copied the imported Chinese porcelain that was no longer available. So in shape and in the blue and white palette of this vase, we see the influence of Chinese porcelain, but the decoration is very interesting, the subject of the decoration, because it is lifted from the frontispiece of a very influential publication that came out in the late 1600s, detailing a Dutch mission to China to petition the emperor to reopen trade with the Dutch East India Company. That mission was unsuccessful, but it resulted in this published account of a first-hand experience of traveling through China, which was accompanied by many illustrations, which remain hugely influential on European design for several generations to come.
I love how this vase is sort of self-referential to the failure, but trying to capitalize on the failure.
Exactly.
And then Ellenor, there's another interesting sort of juxtaposition here with this piece of silver, but tells completely different story, but not completely unconnected.
Indeed, it's aesthetically a completely different object, but an interesting parallel in many other ways. This was made in London in the 1670s, and I think it was collected by the Museum museum in the early 20th century because of the purity of its form. There's something pleasing and satisfying and sort of arts and crafts feeling about that very plain body with those lovely egg-shaped feet, 3 of them, and 2 handles, a little awkward. It's an appealing object that feels very English, but it has engraved on the interior of the bowl the arms of the Royal African Company. So this is an example of how every object tells multiple stories. It's a piece we appreciate for its aesthetic value. The social history is very interesting because it was likely used for food. It was a functional bowl that would have been used on a grand table or on a sideboard for display. And it was probably a corporate gift. The Royal African Company was founded in 1672, and it held a monopoly on England's trade with West Africa, which of course was mainly enslaved Africans or gold or ivory. So there's many, many doors to walk through when we look at an object like this. But in parallel to the vase that we just talked about, it is also the result of the prosperity that was generated by these trading companies that Kit and Jonathan have been talking about.
And one of the newest acquisitions in the installation was this chair, which furthers this narrative quite a bit. So this chair was produced in the Coromandel coast of India, probably in and around the British fort of St. George in what was Madras. And that was a major hub for the production and exportation of printed calico textiles, cottons. That was the major thing they were after, particularly in the 1680s already and 90s when this chair was probably produced. So this chair is a true transcultural object. It is based on European forms with these twisted turn legs, and it was probably made for the merchants themselves to use while they were there in Madras, in their sort of homes, away from home, while they were conducting all of this trade. So there weren't huge numbers of these produced. In fact, we only know 2 other almost identical chairs like this. And one of them has the coat of arms, the one in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, has the coat of arms of Josiah Child, who was the governor of the East India Company. So very much these chairs are totally with the leaders of the East India Company. You can imagine a merchant sitting in this. But it is a wonderful mix of indigenous ebony. It was local craftsmen that made this for these merchants. But I love that there are Hindu aspects to it. Like there's a naga, a serpent that makes the armrest, and its long tongue is actually physically the armrest. But under that is a little bit of sort of tongue-in-cheek subversive carving, I think, anyway. You have this musketed soldier who is probably portraying a British East Indiaman, a soldier for the British East India Company. And I think this is really a prefiguration of what is happening, that they are beginning to use armed force to continue their trade, and what eventually will become total, complete control of India by the British East India Company. And that is just changing at this very moment of this chair, for better or for worse. But so it is such an object rife with all of these themes together, with the bowl, with the vase. But one of the other things I love about these galleries is the juxtapositions, the things that seem so foreign to each other but from the same period. So if we go a little bit ways down to the left wall, we have a case devoted to what we affectionately call the court style for the Sun King Louis XIV. But this object is just as rife with mercantilism. Truly. Ellenor, please tell us more.
It is indeed. I think to understand it aesthetically, first of all, if you haven't visited the galleries, it's a big piece. It's not the petite jewel casket that you might think just from the photograph. It's a large object. And I think you need to picture it in the context of a French interior, aristocratic or court interior of the very late 1600s when this would have been made. So only 20 years later than the ebony chair that we just looked at, and yet an entirely different sensibility. This refined, luxurious use of materials, the ever-present use of gilding on the brass mounts was very much a signature of the workshops who were patronized by Louis XIV and supported, as Jonathan was saying, with a very intentional plan by the minister Colbert, who very much wanted France to be Europe's leader when it came to luxury goods. And that coincided perfectly with the king, Louis XIV's desire to use art and design as embodiments of his power across France, but of course all across Europe.
And what he was able to do was to pull together some of the finest craftsmen from all around Europe, as you're saying, and not only just that, to have this sort of think tank of great technology and material, but also to allow artists like Henri Charles Boulle, who was not maybe the inventor of this design or this style of inlaying or marquetry with tortoiseshell and brass, but he perfected it, he pioneered it. But he also worked with bronze casters, and he designed the piece of furniture, and he managed to pull together multiple what were separate trades or guilds. So you have a cohesion, a harmonization between these different crafts to produce one piece of furniture. So the bronzes fit so well with the design of the marquetry, the inlay of the tortoiseshell, which in itself is coming from the tropics. So again, connecting to the globe. And harmonizing with the interior, but also harmonizing within itself. But that harmonization, that for the first time we can talk about interior design, doesn't just stop in the interior. It goes outside of the borders and into the garden, right, Kit? So.
Correct. Louis XIV oversaw this sort of formalization of design that applied, as you say, not just to interior spaces, but also to the exterior. And this was the moment of that the French formal garden emerged at Versailles, for example. And this urn on the left was produced in Nevers, a city in central France, which had a long tradition of pottery production. But during the reign of Louis XIV, it really upped its design to produce large-scale urns like this, which would have been displayed in outdoor spaces, which became areas of spaces of parade, of formal sociability. And the form of this vase, it really bears closer inspection. It's quite finely modeled with entwined serpents forming the handles. And it's this wonderful, bold, gadrooned base. It's really grand and classicizing and would have formed part of probably a whole arrangement of such vases that would have been seasonally placed outside. And you can see how that might have been in the painting to the right, just towards the edge. There is sort of this cascading buffet that is lined on its various steps with large pottery urns. And this wonderful abstract, almost Jackson Pollock-like-esque decoration was an innovation of Nevers in France. It's called à la bougie in the style of the candle because it emulates the wax dripping from a lit candle. But it's also thought that in sunlight it sparkled and glinted like lapis lazuli. So there was this sort of association with luxurious hard stone as well.
And it's massive, right? It's like
it's like almost toddler height. It's big.
And then, again, we're talking about juxtapositions in this gallery in close proximity. If we go completely across from one wall to the other, we also cross the pond. We go from France to England. And I can't think of any greater difference. In truth, these two objects, they're English. They are about 30, 40 years later. But they are so very different in sensibility. What is unique about British taste, our resident Brit? What's going on here? And also, they're so different to each other. So, yeah.
I think it's sometimes difficult to convince a US audience that in the 18th century, Britain was considered to be a land of liberty. It was enjoyed a free press. It was religiously tolerant. It had a diverse economy and expanding cities. There was class mobility. And this really made it a very attractive place for craftsmen from across Europe to flock to explore new markets. Of course, Britain's increasingly global trade networks for exporting wares, and also for its slightly less stringent guild regulations. So craftspeople could really come to Britain and be creative, explore creatively their field, and enjoy new markets. But also politically, Britain was quite different to France. So France was an absolute monarchy. Louis XIV was the trendsetter, the tastemaker, and the aristocracy of France was politically powerless. They were very much indebted to the king for everything. In Britain, it was slightly different. There was a constitutional monarchy, and the aristocracy wielded considerable power and were the ones who ran the government. So the British aristocracy had an opportunity to pursue and to define their own cultural program.
And you have a really major tastemaker involved in the cabinet on the left, don't we, Ellenor?
Indeed. We are looking at a piece. It's very English for many, many reasons, one of them being its eccentricity. The form itself is a novel form, a wall-hung cabinet with a reference in its design that temple-shaped pyramid on the top, and also the beautiful classicizing swags and eagle heads in ivory on the underside are novel as a piece of furniture. In concept, they allude to ancient Roman architecture, which was very much the prevailing interest of aristocratic English patrons, and indeed across Europe, over the course of the 1700s. This piece, we think, may have been a gift to Thomas Brand from Horace Walpole, who was the son of Sir Robert Walpole, one of the extremely powerful parvenus, really, who we think of as the first Prime Minister of Britain, and the builder of Houghton Hall, which many of you may know. Horace Walpole, his son, was devoted to the family name, and to his friend, Thomas Brand. Each of them had a cabinet of roughly similar design. So this fascination with classical antiquity, the importance of Enlightenment learning for a gentleman of education and of means, the social mobility that is represented by the rise to power of the Walpole family is all emblematic of English culture in the moment. And the ivories, as we see them here, may have been collected by Brand when he was on his grand tour. That is an extended study trip to the continent.
So it's not just a piece of standard British brown furniture. There's actually an underlying eroticism to this cabinet too, right, Kit? There's some when you get close to the details, there's more things going on here.
Yeah, so as a resident Brit, I suppose I should be an expert on that. Yeah, it's funny the association we have with looseness and continental Europe.
It's sort of veiled.
It's veiled. I remember on school trips, actually, we used to, after we've marveled at the architecture and enjoyed the museums and wondered at the mysteries of Catholicism, somehow we would always find our way to a local market and pick up some naughty postcards to write home to our parents on. But
so these are ivory naughty postcards.
But perhaps.
With classical, so we see the Ovid's metamorphosis later in the Swan in the Act and sorry, all the other things. But it's kind of there. It's just you have to look close, right?
That's fun here, I think. That's fun. But let's move on.
Yeah, but this is so different.
It is. This, it's one of the great eye catchers in the gallery. It was made in the workshops of Giles Grundy in London, who enjoyed quite a considerable export market for his distinctive red lacquer furniture. And this lacquer is imitating or referencing Chinese cinnabar lacquer, which in Asia is made up of layers and layers of tree resin, plant resin. It was a formula and a process that remained a mystery in Europe. So various imitations were made using paint and varnish and so forth. And Grundy's work was particularly notable in this vein. But the decoration as well is also incredibly fun. It's totally anti-classical. While the construction of the desk does refer to classical precedent, you see the pediment and the architectural proportions, the decoration is very much an alternative, and it represents what was then known as the Chinese taste and what is now referred to as Shinazeri. China was, at that point, still something of a mystery to Europeans. European traders were very much restricted to the trading ports. They weren't allowed really beyond that to experience the Chinese mainland. And so wherever there is mystery, the imagination steps in. And China and the Chinese taste provided a wonderful avenue for designers and craftspeople to explore this theme. It was a legitimate avenue as well, since the nation's fortunes were so closely tied with trade with Asia. And the British had a sort of horror vacui when it came to this sort of lacquer decoration. You see every possible surface is covered in it. And the sources were various. Some were taken from print sources like Niehoff's account of the embassy to China, published 100 years earlier, but others came from the craftsman's own imagination.
So maximalist design with imagination, which takes us very well to this own maximalist display. I think is so well displayed. We have our own now gallery devoted to our exceptional collection of ceramics. It's really one of the great mainstays of the collection of applied arts. And you're able to explore all of these connections, particularly to China, with the importation of porcelain, which was the major obsession of the Europeans, the preoccupation, if you will. In this case, Kit, that you masked in a very Baroque way, and I love that, explores not just the actual Chinese pieces, but all of these variations of European imitations or imagination thereof. So, yeah, please.
Yeah, exactly. The opening installation of this new space is very much an homage to porcelain and to the impact of Chinese porcelain on the development of the European ceramics industry. So at one end of the gallery, and I do encourage you upstairs to see it, but at one end is this fantastic 14 feet high installation of blue and white ceramics, both Asian and European, both pottery and porcelain. But also in the gallery is a new acquisition, a group of 13 pieces of brown stoneware, an example of which you can see on the left, which at first glance looks somewhat dissimilar to porcelain and somewhat perhaps unassuming. But these incredibly rare ceramics have the DNA of Europe's porcelain industry. They were produced in Meissen in Saxony in around 1700. And in Saxony at the time, the Elector Augustus the Strong was holding captive an alchemist who was tasked with the impossible mission of transmuting base metals into gold. And in order to do that, he had to develop crucibles that were resistant enough to the high firing temperatures of the kiln. And through extensive experimentation, he developed a type of stoneware which was quickly recognized as being valuable in its own right as an artistic medium. This stoneware was so durable that it could be cut and polished like a hard stone. And it was through the continued refinement of this formula that finally this alchemist developed Europe's first white porcelain. So this brown stoneware was only produced for about 10 years. It's really very rare. And the surface is so wonderfully worked. It looks like it's glazed, but in fact it's not. It's just polished on a wheel as if it were stone. It's a really, really wonderful collection.
Yeah, and the third slide on this screen is a porcelain vase, Chinese made. We know that from the gray color of the porcelain body. We've been talking till now about Europe's view of Asia. We looked at the red lacquer bureau bookcase and these blue and white pieces that emulate and aspire to Asian forms. We had thought when we first saw this vase, it's a recent acquisition, a relatively recent acquisition, we assumed that it was Chinese made for export to the European market, because you may be familiar with a large production of Chinese porcelain that came to Western markets. But in fact, our colleagues in the Asian department have pointed out that, in fact, with this very refined, very formal decoration on the body of the vase and the caliber of the painting, they've pointed out that it was, in fact, made for Chinese consumption. So here we have a piece that demonstrates, of the first half of the 1700s, a piece that demonstrates China's own view of Europeans, these two kneeling figures hauling off the great treasure of Chinese production, the Chinese vase. So it's the opposite of Shinazeri, whatever that is, Europeanery. But it sort of completes the circle, I think, as we talk about this subject.
That's fantastic.
Europeanery sounds like something you take penicillin for. But
Oh,
anyway.
boy, yeah. Well, there's also, what is it, porcelain mania, or what is it? Yeah.
The Maladie de Porcelain was
Yeah.
Augustus the Strong, under whose reign this brown vase was produced, declared that he had the Maladie de Porcelain because he spent so much money importing porcelain from China.
Yeah, it is a sickness. But here, going back to the main gallery, I think maybe possibly the three of us are all in agreement here that this in the center of the main gallery is our favorite case of objects. These three objects that explore yet another theme, a stylistically driven theme of the Rococo. And this is really so energetic and expressive. Ellenor, I know you have a deep love of the Rococo. This speaks to you. I guess the question is, why?
Ooh, that's a question for my therapist. But the Rococo, I find myself often defending the Rococo a little bit because in the shadow of modernism, many of us were raised to think of it as frivolous or useless. It's useless in the best way, I think. In the narrative of the 1700s, as the appreciation of classical antiquity was really taking root and becoming the foundation of really Western culture, there was a renegade and spontaneous moment initiated by designers, by goldsmiths and architects in the 1730s and only lasting until the 1760s or so, an exploration of nature that was almost entirely abstract. And you see it in these three images. The red vases on the right-hand side of the screen were mounted in France. The gilt table centerpiece at the top, fabricated, we believe, in England, and the porcelain ewer and dish at the bottom, made in Italy. So this is across Europe in the middle of the 18th century. And as an example, the red-mounted vases, it's a Chinese porcelain body. So these were very rare, even for the market in China, with this beautiful blood red glaze. They were imported to Paris as vases. Some trepidatious goldsmith or bronze worker sawed them in half, cut the long neck off, turned the flaring rim upside down to mount them with gilt bronzes as their cover. You see these wonderful, luscious scrolls that are really about the pleasure of the imagination. They're not about history, they're not about morality, they're not telling a story, they're just about deliciousness. And that is a profound and radical notion that, as I said, unfortunately was short-lived.
I remember, Ellenor, you talking about the lids being like propellers. There's a sort of centripetal force here, isn't there?
You do think they might just sort of take off and hover above the table, indeed. And the table centerpiece too. There's cascading staircases that you pulls your imagination into, as though you could inhabit it. The series of towers.
I think it was Voltaire who described France as being the whipped cream of Europe. And you really get a sense with these vases what he was talking about.
In the best sense.
In the best sense, in the most delicious sense.
We
sure.
like whipped cream.
We adore whipped cream. Speaking of the sort of this suitability of material, the creaminess of porcelain, and its suitability to the modeling, the free modeling and the imagination that drove Rococo design. One of the great hits of our ceramics collection is the basin and the pitcher at the bottom, the ewer, produced in Italy. in Capodimonte, in fact. And the term Rococo derives from the French term rocaille, which was a style of decoration that involved the application of shells and rocks to architectural interiors. So the subject, the modeling of this urine basin is very much in keeping with the Rococo moment. But also, porcelain itself, the name porcelain derives from the porcella shell, which is a Italian term for a cowrie shell. So there's this fantastic marriage of subject and material in this urine basin. Thank you. And shell collecting, additionally, was also considered to be a noble Enlightenment pastime throughout Europe during this period. So although it might seem purely decorative and amusing to our 21st century eyes, this design was sort of deeply embedded in the cultural and intellectual currents of its time.
I love the back, the underside, if you will, of this. Even the little flies are painted in there. You feel like you're in this subterranean, watery environment. This imagination really comes out. So there is the Rococo. But then we punt down the galleries 100 years now. We've rushed forward to the middle of the 19th century or the end of the 19th century in historicism. Now, I like to often think about the 19th century as this awkward century in design history. Maybe that's my own way about it, but I mean affectionately so, that we're talking about people that are faced with industrialization and new idealizations, and as well, of course, experimentation of materials and everything like that. And then they also confronted with centuries and centuries of design that they love, and they need to have it all at once, and sometimes combined on the same object. Like this punch bowl, this monster punch bowl. It's a massive punch bowl, you'll see it in the galleries, which combines sort of Baroque and Rococo sensibilities all melded into one. Or in a more pure way, perhaps, or not so pure, hard to say, this sideboard, which is really one of my total favorites. I'm a lover of the Gothic revival. Ellenor, I know you too love this sideboard in the Gothic revival. What's the story here?
We're now in the mid 1850s and in England, and the designer of this sideboard, William Burgess, as Jonathan said, was in love with the medieval period. And we might think about some of these 19th century designers as experimenting lightly with multiple different styles, but Burgess was passionately committed to the medieval period. He was a believer that it was England's purest moment. He was a major architect in his own right, and he published treatises, he lectured. So he took the medieval period very, very seriously. But he also had a fantastic sense of humor, as we see on this wonderful painted sideboard, which depicts the martyrdom of St. Bacchus. That is a riff on a 14th century poem, a Gothic poem, that plays with the idea not of the classical god of wine, Bacchus, but a fictive medieval saint who is prompted by inebriation, generous to all his friends. He does good deeds prompted by the wine, and then he himself is pushed into a barrel and martyred himself. And then there's fantastic portrait busts surrounding the sideboard showing the various wine regions, wine-growing regions of the world. So there's lightness and humor here. It's far from the ponderous ecclesiastical piece of furniture that it might seem to be at first glance.
So it does combine like concepts of the Middle Ages is not this dark place where you have stone and wood and timbers and no color. On the contrary, Burgess knew and understood that the medieval world was a very colorful world, like a manuscript, and he sort of unfolded a manuscript on a piece of furniture. And I really love the play. Like this image, this detail we have here is representing port. So you have this delicate lady who is perhaps of Portuguese background, and all the other wine varietals too. He's playing with that in a little way. I mean, Burgess is really, truly tongue-in-cheek, because when we open one of these doors, we have this unfinished painting, which Ellenor, what are we understanding this represents?
Well, there are two of these rather dour, miserable medallions painted on either side of the door. One we think representing sobriety, and the other temperance. So these allude to the function of this. It's seen as a sort of domestic piece for wine service. You'd have this in your dining room to store your wine in.
So it's a bit of a warning if you go inside the cabinet to get more, maybe you should stop. But he was so tongue-in-cheek, and he even dressed medieval, I understand. He was really quite a character. But here again, like the Baroque material that we saw too, it was part of an entire interior and harmonized as such. And that is the flight of fancy that is Burgess. But completely different, Rococo Revisited kit is this massive punch bowl. And please, what is going on here?
This is another recent acquisition, and in scale, just to give you a sense, the bowl is about the size of a washing machine drum. It's really a monumental piece. It was designed and produced in Berlin in the Royal Porcelain Factory in 1891. And it was, in fact, a trial piece for a finished example that was shown by the factory at the World's Fair here in Chicago a couple of years later. And you can see on the right a photograph of the finished piece, which was evidently decorated on display in the so-called porcelain porch. The Berlin Porcelain Factory was trying to tap into the American market at that time. Germany had only recently unified in 1871. So its own economy was fairly nascent. 1 in 5 Chicagoans was of German heritage at the time of the World's Fair. 200 German-speaking newspapers at that time as well. So the factory was very keen to access this new market. And you see in the design, the pineapple on the top. This in the Americas is accepted as a symbol of hospitality, which is not necessarily the association in Europe. So they're very much tweaking their designs to appeal to new markets. We haven't quite identified the rest of the iconography. The figures stretching around at the front here possibly allude to the unification, these two youthful figures reaching towards one another. But it's has a sort of prime position in the new galleries. And, Europe, 1600 to 1900, a long way away, a long time ago. So it's wonderful to be able to anchor these galleries in our collection very much in Chicago and give it this sort of immediate relevance to our visitors.
So I think those of you who haven't been up to the gallery yet, you see here a vista approaching from the north side and looking towards that beautiful bowl. I hope you will have a chance to visit, not just today, but often. One of the design aspects we have planned is the ability to regularly swap out objects. There's lots more pieces in the collection in storage, of course. There always are worthy pieces, new acquisitions, loans that come in. So on a regular basis, every 6 months or so, you'll come back and find 1 or 2 new objects and make new discoveries, I hope. So I thank you all so much for coming. I want to acknowledge it's indeed my last event here for the museum. It's been a fantastic experience to work with my outstanding colleagues in the department, but also across the museum. I so appreciate the caliber of this collection and of the institution as a whole, but also the membership is so important to everything that we do. You are curious, you are generous, and very much the community has been a terrific part of my experience here. So thank you.
Thank you, Ellenor. So we have some time for questions. Please raise your hand, and a staff member will bring you the microphone. So any questions?
You mentioned looking at the silver piece early, that it was almost craft. How would you articulate the difference between fine art and arts and craft? I think I know it when I see it, but can't articulate it without too many pejoratives. And is there also a time frame that craft fits into?
I'm sorry, the last part of your question wasn't quite clear.
Is there a time frame?
If I could just speak from my own point of view about the distinction between fine arts and crafts, I think it is, of the period that we're talking about here, 1600 to 1900, I think it is a completely porous membrane. I see, I find it a black hole of discussion without an end result. So many of the artisans creating these pieces didn't think of themselves as one or the other. Some of them had formal training in drawing and went through academic paths to attain their expertise. If that's your definition of fine art, that they had to have academic training, then that's beginning in the 17th century, and certainly by the 18th century, that's when chronologically you see the difference. But as far as I'm concerned, all of these pieces are works of art, and the difference between craft and art is a bit of a distraction.
Thank you. I had a chance to pop up earlier, and I was looking at the earlier part, and I appreciated the honesty about the sort of colonial links. I'm clearly a fellow Brit, so so colonial past there. I wondered if you had any hesitation at all about that honesty opening in this particular political moment.
It's certainly a subject that we thought very carefully about, but ultimately we decided to let the objects lead, and so we agreed we would not force that narrative onto objects that didn't obviously want to acknowledge it. But as you see, the opening grouping very clearly demands that kind of interpretation, and it sort of unfolded naturally. It is an important narrative, and it's one that directly impacts the evolution of design in this period. But it's one that we also wanted to root very firmly in an intellectual context, rather than just throwing out horrendous facts and figures connected to the time period in which these pieces were made.
Yeah, and it all has a reference to design. All of design is influenced by these external or actual political environment, everything. And I think that was a major theme of everything we said today, is how really and truly what is going on in humanity, everything is indeed imprinted in these objects and their design. And you can't not acknowledge that. It's just truth.
But I think as Kit says, there are multiple experiences of these objects. That is certainly one of them, but their pure visual development, their technological development, their importance in economic history, and as ancestors of the way we live now, they're interesting. So every object opens many, many doors, and our job is to sort of lay that out and give the visitor their opportunity.
Hi, this is a rather basic question, but can you explain the difference between Rococo and Baroque?
Sure, I think we can do that pretty effectively. When I was teaching design history, I used to do it very, very oversimplified, and this is not necessarily accurately enough. Baroque, which of course is a slightly earlier period from the 17th century, you have a love of symmetry in design. And there is still very much a strong rooting in classicism, but on stage, made more elaborate and very bold for some. There's also point and counterpoint and all of that. So there's that, again, that mirroring of things, point and counterpoint. But with the Rococo, you have asymmetry. You have, it's almost like a reaction to the Baroque in a way. It becomes much more, breaking free. And from these strict understandings of balance and symmetry. it's finding a balance in the asymmetry. But please add, I've said enough for the Baroque. You all can say, this is our natural divide, by the way. I end with the 1700 and they pick up with the Rococo. So that's, that's why this happens.
I think Ellenor alluded to this. The Rococo was also a style that was very much led by designers and craftspeople, whereas the Baroque was still indebted to the principles of, or allied to the principles of architecture. So it's theatrical, certainly, but the Rococo is more abstracted and, in many ways, collaborative in the production of the works of art that we have in our galleries. But I don't know.
No, I think both those explanations are on target. I'm completely in agreement. I would only add that we don't expect designers or architects to limit themselves to only one or the other. So confusingly, you'll see over the course of an artistic career that someone dabbles in Rococo elements and then goes back to their Baroque roots and vice versa. So the 18th century is full of wonderful surprises. So it's an understandable melding in our imaginations of these two.
One of my favorites is the monkey band. I don't know, do you have a photo?
We don't have a photo,
Okay.
but it is on view.
Okay. I've seen other members in a castle in northern England, fewer pieces than what the AI has. And I think there's a small group in the Northern Ireland Royal Residence outside Belfast. And what I would like is if they could all come here, the other ones come here the way a proper band should be, united. And related to that is, why are they broken up?
There was many editions of the Monkey Band produced, so the ones that you've seen elsewhere are not from the same set as ours. There were, I don't know how many, but many versions of the Monkey Band. And the models were, sorry, I should clarify for the audience that the question is about a group of porcelain figures, monkey figures that were produced in the Saxon state manufactory of Meissen in the 18th century, and they form a band of monkeys playing instruments and singing and so forth. And one of the most beloved elements of our ceramics collection. And we have an unusually complete set of the monkey band. There aren't many that are quite so have quite as many participants as ours. So we wouldn't exclude the possibility of adding missing pieces, but there are examples closer to home as well. So you'll be pleased to hear. Yeah, there are examples of the monkey band in other collections closer to home in the US as well. Yeah.
I love to have just learned recently from you, Kit, that there was a possible connection to an orchestra within the manufacturers of Meissen, that this might have been a tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah, at the time, the monkey band, I mean, it's such a weird thing. It's on display in the gallery, so do go and look at it. It'll make, well, it won't make sense, but you'll know what we're talking about. But it's such a surprising subject. But at the moment that this was launched, this model of monkeys forming an orchestra was launched, the workers of the Meissen factory themselves had formed a sort of an amateur band which played for the king and so on. And so it might have been a sort of self-parody of that moment.
And there is a long tradition of monkeys in particular dressing up and mimicking humans for reasons that we all intuitively understand. But it also should be understood in the context of the debate over the course of the 18th century about whether animals are sentient beings. Do they have emotions? And that was a serious debate in intellectual circles. And these monkeys imitating human activities, it seems the ultimate frivolity, but in fact it ties into a very serious philosophical argument that was going on.
And I'm just going to plug the next talk on October 2nd, which will be about porcelain in the collection, and I promise to feature the monkey band. So
Porcelain
put that in your diary.
Throwdown, huh? Love that. And maybe just one last question. Yes?
Yep. Okay, I want all of you to fess up. What's your favorite piece in the new collection?
Oh, gosh, it's an impossible question, of course, but I will say that before I came to Chicago, and one of the reasons I was dying to take this job was I love so much the Capodimonte ewer and dish that Kit talked about with the shell base. I just find that the most compellingly perfect marriage of subject and medium and freedom of the imagination. I love that piece, but I have many, many favorites. It's a hard question. Hard to leave them behind.
Yeah, equally tricky to answer. I mean, I love the Gasticlou centerpiece. Let's see if we can just bring that up on the screen. It flashed up briefly here in the top left. It's like a miniature stage set, and it really draws you in. It was designed for serving probably salt or spices. There are tiny little receptacles at either end of its base, but other than that, it's purely a feast of the imagination, and the circumstances of its creation are still a mystery to us. So there's much to learn from it still, I think.
Well, I learned something. I didn't know that was one of your favorites. That's great. For me, it's actually a piece that we hadn't featured, the Augsburg cabinet at the very beginning of the chronology of the piece. This is an ebony and ivory cabinet from the 1640s or 50s. I just am enamored of the piece of furniture, and every time I look at it, I notice more and more detail in there. And we've just put it out now for the first time with some of the pieces that were in the contents of the drawers, which included an apothecary set and a writing set. So we had a little bit of fun with that, displaying it out there. But yeah, no, I really wish I could open up this cabinet for people. We can't do that. We have to preserve the object, but it is a performative piece of art. It really is a journey, that thing, and you can play with it online as well. But anyway, thank you for being such a great audience and for such incredible questions. And please enjoy the galleries.